So welcome everybody, good evening. My name is Amy Deephouse and I am a bookseller at the Grand Rapids location of Schuler Books. And I am very grateful to all of you for joining us in this conversation with Mary Frances O'Connor about her new book, The Grieving Brain. Before we get started on the conversation and the questions, a few housekeeping items for you. First of all, this is about you who are joining us in this conversation, and we want to get your questions in this conversation. I do ask, just for housekeeping purposes, that if you have a question, you put that in the Q&A section rather than the chat. That's where I will be looking for those. And after I have a few questions, we'll get to those as well, so that it's more of a group conversation for us all. If you don't already have your copy of the book, The Grieving Brain, you can get that from schulerbooks.com or nicholasbooks.com. If you're an audiobook listener, we encourage you to support one of our locations using Libro FM. I'm going to put some links to those places in the chat function, including a referral code for Libro FM if you haven't tried that for your audiobooks yet. I will get that in there shortly. And then if you have a question, please put that in the Q&A box. As always, we want you to be respectful and thoughtful of others in the group as you're posting those questions. Just be mindful that other people will be able to see those. So I think let me get my copy and paste here. There we go, make sure that went through. All right, without further ado, we have Mary Frances O'Connor, PhD, who is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Arizona in Tucson. She directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab, or the GLASS Lab, investigating the effects of grief on the brain and on the body. Her work has been published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, Biological Psychiatry, and Psychological Science, and featured in Newsweek, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And she still lives in Tucson, Arizona, and she is going to share some of that sunshine with those of us in Michigan where we don't see it as much. So Mary Frances, hello, welcome. We are so thrilled to have this conversation with you tonight.
I'm so grateful for you having me, Amy. This will be a nice chance to talk.
Yes, yes. All right. Well, I have a few questions to start, and then we will get going with some of our participants' questions. If you wouldn't mind starting off, just letting us know a little bit about sort of the inspiration behind this book, any information that you want to share about how it came about.
Sure. This is a common question because I think, if you're going to pick up a book, you kind of want to know who you're absorbing, right? Well, I have to say that it really came from two parts of myself, I guess. The first is that, if you sit next to someone on the airplane and they say, "Oh, what do you do?" And you say you're a psychologist, that's often a very long conversation. And so for a while I would say, "Oh, I'm a neuroscientist." But then they'd say, "What kind of neuroscientist?" And I would say, "Well, I study grief." And then that would be a long conversation. But what I realized in those conversations was that we know in the grief research world far more than we are doing a very good job of letting the rest of the world know about. So we are still in the beginning stages, but it struck me that if I could put into the hands of people the things that we know now, they could find the ways to apply them to their own grief experience, and that potentially that would be useful to them. How the brain works, how the mind works, why some of the issues with grief and grieving may be so intense, all of those types of questions, which I'm sure we'll get into. Mm-hmm. But I have to say there's, another motivation that people, I think when you write about grief, people want to know if they can kind of trust you, if you've walked the walk, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And while my grief has not been worse than anyone else's, I experienced the death of my mom when I was 26. She had had breast cancer for about 13 years. And, when she was first diagnosed, she was actually not, I was 13, and mm-hmm. she was not supposed to survive the year, which I didn't really understand at 13, but I certainly knew the profound change that made in our lives, in the lives of my sister and myself. And so that really, it isn't even just about the grief that I experienced that I wanted to understand, but also about really understanding her grief. And so a lot of my work has focused really on sort of that empathic response. How do we understand the people around us who are grieving in addition to our own grief experience? So I think, between the two, things have sort of merged, and the book was what came out of it.
Sure. Yeah. And you include a lot of the sort of past research and the research studies that you've participated in, as well as ones that have happened before you. But you also include a lot of sort of anecdotal, personal stories from your own life, from people that you've interacted with, Tucson-specific stuff about the Ben's Bells project. So what was the writing process like for you for this book? How did that?
There's potentially another motivation there, which was I wanted to take an opportunity in writing a book to really step back from the way that academics are trained to think and thus to write. And while there's a good reason for being trained in the way that we are taught to write, which is primarily you don't say anything if you kind of can't prove it, unless it's a hypothesis, and then you're probably planning to prove it. Right. It's really only one way to think. And so by describing in more common day terms what I knew about the neuroscience of grief, I was able to really even understand it differently or better myself. And so part of the process was really thinking about how would I explain this to, my friends? How would I explain this to my undergraduates? And that led me to describe research in a different way. As difficult and as painful as the topic of grief is, it also is fascinating and incredible that the brain can encode our loved ones, and then that it has a way of understanding what's happened, that eventually it comes to know that that person isn't someone we're going to see on this earthly plane again. And so the writing process was both taking studies that I work with all the time, day to day, and sort of translating them into language that would make sense for, like I say, my friends or my students.
Right. And
also, what was it about what I knew about grief from the research that made sense in my own life, the losses that I had experienced, and perhaps, as you say, more so, the number of people who've been kind enough to share their story with me when I did clinical interviews of them, to really get a chance to let their stories come through as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I found it very, very approachable in that way, because you do get a lot of the science, which is interesting, but being able to apply it through those real life examples sort of makes it feel more accessible in that way. I have one main question that popped up a lot for me was what impact you think the pandemic has on the grieving process, or might have on the grieving process, when we're not able to participate in the social, memorials and just sort of that social acknowledgement that helps your brain start thinking about things in a different way. Obviously, we won't know for a long time, but what impact do you think that might have?
Yeah, it really is, as I would like to say, or as I would say in my lab, it's an empirical question, right? What we do know, of course, is that, 940,000 people have died of COVID just in the US, and that each of them, demographers, sociologists, estimate there are 9 loved ones that are, associated with each of those deaths. So at its basic level, we just know that the amount of bereavement is much larger than what we usually see in any given year. And so that in and of itself has impacts, right? There are just more people dealing with this. And consequently, also their support system, the people they may usually lean on, may also be dealing with their own grief in a concurrent way that is less common under other periods of history. But I think for me, it's also not just what is grief like during the pandemic, but why would it be different? And I think the reason I've been doing some grief research during the pandemic, interviewing people and what their experience has been like. And it really gets back for me to one of my main ways that I understand how the brain deals with the death of a person. And the difficulty for the brain is that on the one hand, you may have memories of the loss of this person. Obviously, you can call to mind the experiences of the loss of this person, but you also have this attachment belief, which is, this is my one and only. They're going to be there. You know, I'm going to be there for them. They're going to be there for me. If they're not here, I should go get them. And those two pieces of information, that they're always going to be there and that they have died, those take a long time to put together in the brain to really understand, what does it mean to retire without this person? For example, if I've been planning to retire with them, for 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
So in the pandemic, what has been particularly challenging, I think, is that those memories we would ordinarily make, like being at the bedside and seeing the person decline physically, or going to a memorial service, right? Where all your loved ones, your family, your friends come and you're doing all the rituals that happen when someone dies. There's not as many opportunities to make those really salient memories. You know, I have a woman who I was interviewing who talked about, she's in her 70s. She drops off her husband at the ER. He's having, a little trouble breathing. But, in the next couple of days, they're taking him off a respirator and he's passed away. And she didn't get to see any of that. And so that inability to create those sort of caregiving memories, I think will make even more difficult sort of letting it really sink in, the reality of the fact that they're gone when it happened in such a unusual way for most cultures and most times in history.
Yes. Yeah. The other thing that I really found interesting was the dual process model of coping. That's very different from the 5 stages of grief that we sort of all grew up learning about.
Right.
That, with the dual process, it's very fluid and you're always going back and forth from, sort of moving forward, but also dealing with the past.
Yeah.
How does that, when you talk about grieving as a learning process, how do you apply that sort of dual process model to that learning, either in the conditions that we're in right now or just in general?
Yeah. The dual process model, which was developed by Maggie Strobe and Henk Schut in the Netherlands, which I had the great honor of getting to spend some time with them while I was writing the book. The dual process model describes the fact that people who are grieving have 2 types of stressors that they have to deal with. On the one hand, they have to deal with the stress of the loss. And this is what we typically think of as grieving, the really difficult emotions, all those intrusive thoughts that you can't get out of your head, all of those sorts of changes that you have to deal with. But there are also what they call restoration stressors. So I think of this as, how am I going to restore a meaningful life while I'm carrying, the absence of this person? And, everything from, am I going to sell the house to, should I, in the case of a pet, do I want to get another pet? How do I do, all the tasks that maybe your partner did, right? So how do I go shopping for clothes if that's not something you have been doing for 10 or 20 years? Those sorts of restoring a meaningful life stressors are equally difficult. And the oscillation that they talk about, that I think is just the genius of this model, is that on any given day, we may be dealing with loss-related stressors or restoration-related stressors. And the sign of the sign of mental health is really that flexibility, to be able to revisit the past, to think about really wonderful memories, and also to be able to be in the present and plan for the future. So the ability to oscillate back and forth, in addition to just sort of having everyday life a little bit too, it's that flexibility, I think, that really helps us to learn about what it means now to be in the world with the absence of this person.
Mm-hmm. And that rings true also when you think about grieving as a healing process.
Mm-hmm.
If you're healing from something, it's not a linear, you go,
that's right,
in a straight line.
That's right.
It goes all over the place, whether you're healing from something emotional or something physical.
Yeah, it does.
Takes time, and you go 2 steps forward and then 3 steps back, and it might never look the same.
Right.
When you get to the end.
That's right.
As it did at the beginning. So that's
right.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, I think part of the reason, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is a psychiatrist who came up with those stages of grief, she was doing, really cutting edge work at the time. She was talking with terminally ill people and people who were grieving, and that was not something that was done in the 60s, right? And she was interviewing people about their experience. And so the what that she wrote about, people do feel a lot of anger, people do feel a lot of denial, and people feel acceptance too. What she was describing is accurate. People do feel all of those things.
Right.
It's that they don't happen in a linear set of stages, just as you said, but rather over time in general, we see that yearning declines and we see that acceptance increases. But if you're anticipating a day when you don't ever feel that wave of grief that just knocks you off your feet, if that is what is in your head as I've adapted, that's, grief is just the natural human reaction to losing someone we love very much. So, if I open a drawer and see my dad's signature, right? To this day, I can be knocked off my feet in that moment. It doesn't mean that I haven't been grieving. It doesn't mean I'm doing anything wrong. This is totally normal, and especially around anniversaries and holidays.
Sure. Yes. And that's another important part of the book, is that there's not a right and a wrong way to grieve. Yeah. Just like there's not a right and a wrong way to learn or it's different for every person. It's different every day, every minute.
Yeah. And every relationship. Yeah. Exactly. So when you think about how different your love is for different people in your life, right? Even if you have 2 kids, right? It's just different. The relationship is just different. And I think that's the way human relationships work. And so maybe it shouldn't surprise us so much that grief would be really different, because grief really is that form that love takes after a loved one has died. And so it is going to look very, very different under all sorts of different circumstances. And that's totally normal.
That is okay. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. I think I'm going to, one more. So obviously you talk about a lot of your research and the research that you looked at. Did your research take you down any sort of interesting rabbit holes that maybe didn't make it into the book, but that were interesting for you?
Oh, interesting. That didn't make it into the book. Well, it takes a long time to get a book published, and especially during a pandemic, as it turns out. And so research has been done even since the book was published, right? And so, I always wish, if only I could have included one of the most striking findings I'm really just taken with of late is that a study came out from the University of Colorado Boulder, done by Zoe Donaldson, who studies voles. And these are these rodents that mate for life. They, right? They have a partner and they will prefer them over any other vole. It's their one and only. And so she studies what happens when they get separated. And there are things, of course, that you can understand about the brain in a more simplified context like that. And one of the things she just recently discovered is there's a set of neurons, individual neurons, that fire when they're approaching their loved one. We can't say loved one because they're animals, but when they're approaching their pair bonded mate. Right. So there are neurons that fire only for that, for nothing else, just approaching their pair bonded mate. And as the bond strengthens, as time passes, as they have pups together and so forth, there are more and more of these neurons. And I think that's just a remarkable thing, that the brain is so consumed with the importance of our loved ones that it would actually devote entire, neurons specifically to this activity. And I think that helps us sort of think about, when we're grieving, it really is a physical process that neurons have to rewire. It's a biomechanical process where they make different connections, they sprout different, axons. And so thinking about, why does grieving take a long time? It helps me sometimes to remember that this is also a physical process happening in the brain, to really understand that we're not going to be approaching our loved one in the same way anymore.
Yeah. One question that I had also had, so we'll start on some of these Q&As from the participants, is in the book you make a distinction between grief and grieving. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Sure. I have found this to be very helpful, and I think others as well. So grief is that moment, right? It's when you get just knocked off your feet with that wave of, it's just ferocious and just overtakes you. Grieving is the way that experience of grief changes over time, but without going away. And so an example of that is, I mean, this happens in multiple ways, but one example is that when you're knocked off your feet the first 100 times, right? You think, this is unbearable. I'm not even gonna, I can't even get through this. And the 101st time, it's just as intense, right? But it may also be a little bit familiar. You may recognize, this is grief. I know what this is. I sometimes even know how to manage it. It still feels the same, and I wish I wasn't feeling it, and I wish it wasn't true, but I have a little bit better understanding how it fits in my life. And so grieving is really that change over time.
And if we're talking about over time, did you notice any differences, or has any research been done to compare the grief and grieving process after a sudden loss versus something like Alzheimer's or a terminal illness, where either you're saying goodbye repeatedly or just over a long time before the actual loss occurs? Whether there's been shown to be any difference in those types of grief or grieving processes?
Yeah, there are differences.
Okay.
In the case of a sudden death, which isn't necessarily a violent death, but simply an unexpected death, I think you have the additional difficulty that the brain wasn't predicting this was going to happen. When we have a terminal illness in a loved one, we on some level know that this is coming. It doesn't make it easier when it happens, but it's just, there's a different quality of the feeling. And so the suddenness can cause a lot of grief severity, especially initially. On the flip side, though, there's also a difference between, something like congestive heart failure or cancer, where it's been, a fair amount of time, but something like a dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, where there's caregiving often that goes on for years. We also know that has unique impact on grief and grieving, often because the social world of a caregiver has often shrunk quite a lot. There's a lot to do. It's hard, you don't have an opportunity to go out because you can't bring them with you, and you may not have a way to have someone come in. For a lot of reasons, that social world really shrinks. And it is very stressful. It is physically stressful. It's emotionally stressful. And so when the death happens, one aspect that can be true is people can feel a lot of relief. And that's completely understandable. They can also feel guilt over feeling relief, which is its own difficulty. but we know that physically they may be really very run down. And so that really changes the way the grieving happens for them often. Not only do they have to sort of restore a meaningful life, but in many cases, they also have to rebuild a social life as well. And that's not easy to do after a long period of time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So when you're doing these studies, and by you, I mean you specifically, but also generally,
Sure.
how is it determined who is going to participate and how those participants, I mean, you can't just go around and be like, hey, if you lost someone, come and check it out. I mean, how do you get enough of a research base,
Yeah.
to actually get valuable data from?
Yeah, it works in a couple of different ways, kind of depends on the study. And I will say some ways are better than others. Some we've done and realized, oh, maybe that wasn't the best way to do that. So in one case, there is a group of people who are looking for help. They're looking for answers. And so especially in clinical research, we often will advertise, have you had the death of a loved one? Are you struggling with the death of a loved one? And people sort of self-refer. You might describe it that way.
Sure.
And we try to sort of make that advertisement through a variety of different venues, through bereavement support groups, through hospices, through funeral homes, places where you might expect that there would be people who might self-select into that. But the other kind of research that is done is where it's more what we might think of as epidemiological research. So this is studies where everyone sort of in a representative way is recruited into a study. And then over time, some of those people will experience loss. And so if it's a longitudinal study, then we can actually look at the people who experienced loss and those that didn't, because their recruitment was not based on whether they were going to experience loss or whether they had experienced loss. So it's a much more representative way of sampling the population. And one of the things we discovered in one of the very first large studies like that was done was that people are more resilient than we thought. Because if you're only relying on the help-seeking population, who are very important, but that can skew your understanding of what grieving is like. And in fact, when we did this more representative sampling, it turned out that that the majority of people were very resilient.
Yeah. What kind of research has been done with children on this topic, if any?
This is an excellent question. And I will say I am not a child psychologist, so I sometimes stumble here. There is quite a bit of research done on helping to support children. One of the very early places was the Dougie Center. So like DOUG, like Doug, with a Y at the end, the Dougie Center. And they have just done some phenomenal work with bereavement support. The National Alliance for Childhood Grief, it's NACG, has also done just some tremendous work. So we know that children do grieve. That may sound a little odd, but there was a time when we thought children didn't understand death and so they wouldn't grieve. But we know now that that's not true. Even when grief looks different in children, it's not that they're not grieving. And so if you are concerned or thinking about what, a child that you might know, it can be very useful to look at those type of resources to see what is known about what's normal, what helps, what schools can have programs that are very useful. They're not as widespread as we might like. Yeah, so there is a lot known, just not all of it known by me.
Sure. This combines several sort of questions and comments, and it is something that you address in the book, looking at sort of common ways to manage grief or common characteristics of grieving, healthy versus unhealthy. If you could speak some to that, you do that quite a bit in the book, but sort of coping skills and healthy versus unhealthy grieving.
Yeah, I think one of the ways I think about this is most helpful to me and probably to other people is that it's useful to have a toolkit with a bunch of different ways of coping. And so if you're always coping in the same way, that doesn't always fit the situation that you're in. And so it isn't necessarily the best choice at that moment, even if it's a good choice some other time. And what I mean by that is, take, for example, denial, right? I'm pretending this isn't happening. You might think, well, that's a terrible way to cope. But honestly, if you're at your daughter's soccer game and you're, thinking about this person that you've lost, it might be perfectly okay in that moment to be like, I'm just not going to think about this. Just not going to think about it. Not going to go there. Just going to cheer for this game and pretend it's not happening. Right? Because in that moment, that's the goal, is to be there to support your daughter in her soccer game. So it isn't so much that one method or one coping skill is always good or always bad, but rather, does it work at the time? And so other examples might include, doing fun activities, which we think, I'm not going to have a good time. Why would I even do that? I'm probably going to feel worse. And while people should definitely at times feel like they can withdraw if that is what they need, there may also be times, so in that flexibility sense again, where it may be worth going. Maybe you're not going to have a great time, but it is also useful to have the habit of going out and doing things, because over time that will change as your grieving changes. And so to have those habits in place can be quite useful. So again, I'm not suggesting that that's the right thing for everyone all of the time, but it can be an important thing in maintaining those social connections with your living loved ones too.
Which is something that you talk quite a bit about as well, the importance of not necessarily replacing the person that was lost and trying to, get someone to fill that hole, right. But that other things can maybe sort of pick up the slack, and how important those other people are, which I think is another thing during the pandemic that isn't necessarily as present or as easy to maintain.
Absolutely. And it can be hard to ask. And so during the pandemic, there haven't been as many opportunities to just discover, oh, my cubicle mate, gosh, her mom died. I'm going to do something. I'm going to talk with her. I'm going to take her for coffee, whatever. There aren't as many opportunities to just discover that someone is grieving. And I think that has been really challenging.
Mm-hmm. And so what would you say to someone who, is reading this book, not as someone who is experiencing the grief, but as someone tangential to who has someone nearby who is experiencing grief and really wants to help them? What would be the applications for them from this research?
I think flexibility is important here too. So in the book, I make this analogy to, if you've ever been taking care of a little kid and they fall and scrape their knee, sometimes you go scoop them up, you get the Band-Aid out, you hug them and hold them. And at other moments you may look over and be like, oh, that was tough. You can do it. Like, get up, it's okay, because you can see the bigger picture where the kid can't at that moment see the bigger picture. And so in being a support, there can also be an importance of that flexibility of not always offering the same type of support to someone. But I think maybe the more important piece is being supportive, loving someone who is grieving is hard. It's painful to watch someone in pain. And if your goal is to take the pain away, you're going to be frustrated because grief has pain. So if the goal is to be with them, to love them, to feel loving toward them, then that is a goal that can be achieved and probably will make them feel more understood than if, even on an implicit level, the idea is, why aren't they feeling better? I'm doing everything I can, because it's just not how it works.
Mm-hmm. So is there, I know a lot of the studies in the book are quite long-term. Is any of the studies, or any of the studies that you participated in, or any studies that you're working on right now, looking at more long-term grieving process, where you check in with these people in 10 years or 5 years or 1 year?
I don't currently have any studies that are that long term, but we do have studies of that type. The kind I was describing earlier with the epidemiological studies.
Mhm.
There's a very large study through Rotterdam, through Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, where they started studying folks in the late 90s. And they've been following them for a very long time. Of course, they're adding new people all the time, and have been asking about their grief experiences. And so we actually have, for example, there's a follow-up study of 7 years where they look at sort of cognitive function over 7 years. And that's a unique data set, an opportunity to really see what changes long term, as you're describing, happen when people have had this experience.
Mhm, mhm. Again, combining a couple of questions of quite unique circumstances. People who don't live anywhere near the loved one, or
Yeah.
maybe have moved since the loved one passed away, and so they're not in a place that has any, specific memories or triggers. What sort of impact that might have when it's not someone you shared a house with, or
Yeah.
really saw on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. This was partly my experience, when I go to my hometown in Montana, where both my parents lived, and where my sister and I would come back when we were taking care of them before they died. Boy, when I'm there, even though my mom died, 20 years ago, more, it's like she's more alive there, because there are so many reminders of her that I don't have day to day in Tucson, Arizona, because she was never here. I think one of the impacts that has is it can be easy to just sort of put it out of your mind and not think on it, right? Like you're not cued to think on it.
Mhm.
Although I will say, so I have some of my father's furniture, for example, and I do think of him often because of, seeing things that were in his home. So it isn't necessarily the case that being far away that you don't have reminders. But I think maybe the deeper question, I could be wrong, but maybe the deeper question is partly, does it make sense if we are overwhelmed with grief for a person who we don't live with? And I think it can matter dramatically. Loss is really about you and another person were in the world together. So like, if you think about the word daughter, that word implies two people,
Mhm.
right? So I use daughter to describe myself, but it's actually about two people. So then how are you a daughter in the world if your mother has died, right? And so it doesn't necessarily matter if she's in the area or not, if it is a challenge for you to work out how to function in the world without your spouse, without your child. Those can be true even if, your adult child has been living somewhere else for a long time, or your ex-wife or your ex-husband dies. That can be very, very difficult, because they were and are an important part of how you function in the world. That sort of overlap of yourself and that other person. You can feel that went missing, even when it's been a long time or a lot of distance.
Mhm, mhm. Are there things that, um, obviously, if you are in a long-term care situation, you're starting to prepare for that loss. Are there other things that just the general population could do to sort of build the potential for that resilience,
Hmm.
in the case of a loss or
Right. So it sounds like you're asking about the people who might be adjacent to the caregiver, so to speak. Is
right,
that
right.
right? Yeah. Okay.
Or
Just wanted to
just
make sure
anybody who's like, I know that the
yeah.
likelihood of losing someone close
Yeah.
to me is high.
Yeah.
I want to be a resilient griever. I want
Yeah.
to be healthy in that. How do I prepare myself for that,
Yeah.
or train my brain to
Right.
learn after the
Right.
fact?
I mean, part of the answer is, the good news is most of us are resilient grievers, right? So odds are you will be, which is good. The other thing is that, you can try to prepare, and it just is never like you expect. in my experience. So there's a piece of it that you also just can't prepare for, right? It's going to strike you in ways that are very unexpected. Mm-hmm. But having said that, certainly one thing that matters is knowing that you don't have what we might call unfinished business. So if there is something you wish you had said to someone, and I forgive you, or thank you, or just even I love you, knowing that you have said that. Now, when there's a long-term illness, part of what can happen is this can get said over and over again, and that can somehow reduce the meaningfulness of it. Mm-hmm. So it isn't necessarily that you have to say it again and again. I love you, fortunately, is something we can say again and again and never really seems to lose its meaning. So that's an easy one. But I think if you are estranged from someone, it can be very important to reconnect. And sometimes if there's been a difficulty in the relationship, that can, be helpful to do. I mean, there was abuse, say, for example, or something that can be helpful to do with a therapist or a counselor sort of working with you in that regard. But in terms of preparing, I think, if you are doing the things that matter to you with them, that is all we can ask for,
Mm-hmm. So obviously, if folks have not already read the book, we hope that they will, and we'll get some more of the examples. And again, it's very readable, very accessible. If they enjoy your book or have more questions or are more interested in this topic, are there other authors or titles that you would recommend people check out that have either a similar readability or are tied in somehow?
Right. That's a great question. So I would say a couple of things. There are some terrific authors who really write about the what of grief. So I write a lot about the why and the how, but sometimes you just need to hear that you're normal, right? Because other people are describing the experience that you're having, which can feel really abnormal. Mm-hmm. And so I can recommend Megan Devine's It's Okay That You're Not Okay. I think is an excellent book, especially for someone who's very early in grief. It is a book that I give often because it isn't, it's not all the details. It's just, here's where you are. I hear you. I've been there, and it's okay. Mm-hmm. Another really good book is Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking, is a really just wonderful, wonderful one. On the other side, if people are really interested in sort of the neuroscience or the biology of these things, Peter van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, is a really, really good book. Not grief exactly, but related things to what I write about. And I would recommend that one.
Absolutely. No, I actually thought of that book multiple times.
While I take that as a great compliment.
They definitely overlap. Just seeing grieving and learning and healing. It's all tied together. Yeah. Slightly off topic, and I know I haven't gotten to all of the questions because they keep rolling in, but I'll make sure to forward any on so that you're able to see them. What are you currently reading as a reader? I like to know what people are reading right now.
Oh, that's a fun question. I'm a huge science fiction fan. Okay. So I recently finished Project Hail Mary, and I am currently reading Dune again, which I read a long time ago, and now I'm enjoying again. But I also am reading a book on science communication called Made to Stick, which I think is terrific. We can all get better as scientists at learning how to communicate what we know for an audience that is, will understand things differently than we do. So Made to Stick is very good. And I'm reading, and I'm going to get the order wrong, but the Fat, Salt, Acid, the cookbook. Yeah. So I'm trying to read that too, although that one's a slow go for me at the moment.
All right. And what are you looking forward to in this year, either work or non-work related?
well, I don't know if I should say this out loud, but I'm thinking about writing another book.
Okay. Well, my next question was going to be what's next for you. So you can just tie right into that.
So as an academic, because I teach, summers are definitely the time that I have more time to do that. And so I've been thinking about, is there a way that I could wrangle my schedule? Because research happens all year round. So
Sure.
is there a way I could wrangle my schedule to get a little time in the summer to start writing again?
Yes, wonderful. And if viewers want to keep in touch with sort of your research and what you're up to, is there a place that they can find you either on social media or elsewhere?
Yeah, I have a site that is me and my lab, and that's maryfrancesoconnor.com.
Okay.
With no punctuation, because there's a lot of punctuation in my name. It's also, I'm Dr. MFO on Twitter. And so that's also a place, I'm not a big tweeter, but I do send out information that way as well.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Mary Frances, for spending some time with us, taking time out of your schedule. We've really enjoyed this conversation, and I know the questions keep pouring in. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get them all in there, but a lot of them are addressed in the book. So hopefully if you haven't read the book yet, you will take this opportunity. Again, you can get the book at schulerbooks.com or nicholas.com. I put the links in the chat area. Our websites are always open, and we do ship around the world. So hopefully you will check those out. Thank you also to Harper One for sending you our way. And thank you everybody who participated. We've had about 80 people who joined us tonight, and it was really a joy to have you all here from all around the world. That's all we have for tonight. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Amy, for bringing this, often difficult conversation to people. If people can, have a reason to talk to a friend about how they're feeling, then the book has done its job.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, happy reading, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. And again, say hello to the sunshine for me. I miss it.
All right.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.